Okay, so hey guys, and welcome back to another predictions video. And in today's video, I'm going to be predicting the Stevens versus Alvarez fight. And so if you are new around here and you have not yet subscribed, please do so, like the video if you do indeed like the video, and let's get straight into it. So obviously this is something a little bit different to what I normally do. I mean, I have spoken and predicted former BKFC fights, but this one is, a bit of an interesting one. Maybe not the biggest of BKFC fights in which have been in the past, in which I have spoken about. But to be honest, I feel like the BKFC scene is still lacking a little bit. I feel like there isn't a clear star to really carry on the scene after Mike Perry, because I mean McGregor has come and taken over. He's brought more eyes to it, I suppose, in that aspect, and if he ever does fight in BKFC, he's going to bring a massive fan base, and so I suppose for that extent it's been good for the sport, but maybe bad through all the bad press in which he's been having as of recent. But he kind of went out there and said that Mike Perry isn't kind of welcome back to the uh, organization, not allowed to fight on the organization because of his loss to Jake Paul. I think there's that rivalry there with Jake Paul and Conor McGregor. To be fair, just on the day that I'm recording this, there was the photos kind of brought out with the Trump election where Jake Paul and Conor McGregor are kind of right next to each other, seemingly getting along. So perhaps they've kind of solve their differences to an extent. I'm not too sure if they have or not, and maybe that means that Mike Perry might be allowed back into BKFC, but at the same time, he's gone away and has built his own company now with Dirty Boxing. It's very kind of different. It's definitely got that underground type theme. I don't even know if it's legal, to be completely honest. I mean, it's got seemingly no kind of television broadcasting system behind it. It seems relatively, low budget to an extent, but it has had a big name in Yoel Romero fight on it and get a big knockout. It had John Jones come to the first event as well. It's definitely something different. It was, of course, set in like an underground type sewage place, which looked pretty cool, to be fair, but yeah, he seemingly got something going there. He might fight on it himself, and he might bring more eyes to that through doing that. So perhaps, that's the end of the Mike Perry BKFC run, which, to be honest, has been an excellent run. He has been by far the most entertaining, perhaps the best BKFC fighter in which we had seen so far. And now, like I mentioned, it seems like that time has come to an end. So perhaps you look at it and you go, this is the biggest fight in the organization. I mean, Jeremy Stevens is somebody who, is 2-0 in bare knuckle. He has that history behind him with the whole kind of UFC scene. Obviously, he's not really had the best of runs in the UFC. I mean, his record was 29 and 21 as a whole at the moment, with 18 KOs and 3 submissions, 2 of them coming in boxing and 2 of them coming in bare knuckle as well. And so, like I mentioned, not the best of records as of at all, but he's kind of maybe just gotten a name off the UFC and gotten his name off that moment with Conor McGregor, which, to be honest, you kind of have to look at it and go, that perhaps was the best moment he could have ever asked for in his career. He got shut down by McGregor, who the fuck is that guy? He got shut down and he got embarrassed, to be completely honest. And that clip, I'm sure he has seen a trillion times, and I'm sure is pretty much sent to him every single time he fights. But he's ridden that high, and I mean, there's been many of fighters as of recent in which you look at the misfit scene, you look at some kind of crossover boxing. A lot of it has been from UFC fighters who have made themselves a name, even if they haven't achieved too much, even if they didn't do much in the UFC. They've been able to go and create themselves a name somewhere else. Even with BKFC as well, they've been able to create a name. We've seen some BKFC fighters who are unknown go and fight on Misfits and seemingly make quite good money and to get put on quite a big stage. And it's the same with the UFC. I mean, we have Rothwell on this card as well, and that's a pretty big fight to have for BKFC because he was in the UFC. He had that name from the UFC. He had that kind of cringy moment when he was doing his evil speech, I suppose, after his fight in the UFC, but he didn't really achieve much in the UFC. He went on and is now, you know, been one of the biggest names in BKFC and is getting co-main event slots. And the guy he fights, it probably isn't going to be the highest of levels. I believe he's a British fighter, and like I say, I don't really think it's a crazily high level fight, but it's still bringing more eyes to him because he was in the UFC. And, you could argue that this fight, Alvarez versus Stevenson, is a McGregor former foes. Obviously Stevens didn't fight McGregor. Alvarez, of course, did and gave up his belt to McGregor, and McGregor went and had a great run after that, a great reign. And, two moments, career defining moments, even though they came out on the bad side of things versus McGregor, that really have propelled their careers. And so, in general, it's just great to see. And I suppose to, go through the overview, I probably should have done this earlier, but I mentioned Stevens' record, Alvarez's record, 30-8 with 16 KOs and 8 submissions, and with 2 bare knuckle fights. This is a 5-round fight. Alvarez's last fight was a loss via stoppage in round 2 versus Perry, that being in December of 2023. So it's been over a year out, and he didn't get stopped badly, but he got hurt a lot, and it was a doctor stoppage, and perhaps he was questioning to himself if he even wanted to be involved in BKFC anymore. I'll touch upon that in a bit more in a moment. But Stevens' last fight was a win via unanimous decision versus Taylor. He's kind of had to go down a bit of a different route with BKFC. Obviously, he's been propelled, into now a big matchup, mainly off his name. But for the most part, it's not been him getting straight away thrown into the big name BKFC fights like something like Alvarez. Obviously Stevens' record wasn't that good in the UFC, and his kind of main big win was maybe perhaps you kind of look at Dos Anjos when he fought him in 2008, and so a long time ago, and really hasn't done too much else, in the UFC otherwise, and had quite a lot of losses. He fought some top guys, but he had quite a lot of losses, and so he's had to kind of fight a little bit lesser opponents to build himself up and build and get a bit of a track record with BKFC fans and just in general. And he's done that, and he's looked very successful in the fights in which he has had so far in BKFC, and he's looked very good. So perhaps you'd say that he is now deserving of this fight versus Alvarez. Alvarez, like I mentioned, is 41 and Stevens is 38. So they are both on the older side of things. Not perhaps stupidly old, in which we have seen some of these crossover, matchups. Of course, not like the Mike Tyson's age or the Anderson Silva's age or anything like that. So I suppose just on the border of being acceptable, and a fight in which this deserves to still kind of be sanctioned, even though it was a few more years, and it definitely. Alvarez would be way past it. Stevens just kind of hitting 40, not quite there yet. Might still have a bit more to give, and you'd like to think that perhaps he does. But yeah, in general, I feel like this is a good fight, an interesting fight. I feel like if this was in the UFC 10 years ago, this would have been a much clearer contest in Alvarez's favour. But I think times have changed. I think obviously Alvarez is coming off that very tough test versus Perry and wasn't able to be successful really at all, to be honest. He did certain things well, but for the most part wasn't successful and is on the older side of things now. And Stevens has been looking good, like I say, has gained perhaps the first clear bit of momentum at a high level in his career ever. And so, this is definitely going to be an interesting contest. I think the weight definitely could play a factor. I mean, Stevens is going to have to gain 20 pounds most likely to be able to get to Alvarez. Alvarez fought 20 pounds heavier in his last fight than that of Stevens. Alvarez was trying to get up to that Perry weight, and he still looked very small compared to that. So maybe Alvarez might come down in weight a little bit. So maybe it is a bit more of an even weight matchup. But still, it's going to be interesting to see what kind of weight Alvarez comes in at. In general, of course, BKFC is very dangerous, especially to older fighters as well. And Alvarez probably is going to want to come in a bit heavier because it might make him less susceptible to taking punches if he is that bit heavier. And, I don't think his chin's gone at all. I think he showed a lot of toughness and a lot of grit, and he showed that he still has a very good chin in that last fight versus Perry. But still, like I say, that damage is going to come. I'm sure after he took that loss versus Perry, because it was quite a brutal defeat and because he did take a lot of damage, I'm sure he really kind of had to go away, reconsider things, weigh the options, see if he wanted to carry on or not. I'm sure he was very close to retiring, and I wouldn't have blamed him at all. And so, Stevens is still, going to be risking things coming up as well. If he's the smaller guy taking punches, he's still not young. He's definitely going to be, having to deal with the damage in which Alvarez is going to put on him. But, like I say, that's definitely going to be an interesting thing. And in general, I mean, Alvarez as a fighter, he's pretty much completed martial arts to an extent. I mean, Bellator champion, had that great rivalry with Michael Chandler as well, and the fights in which they had together. Was a UFC champion as well, and looked excellent when he was fighting. Had some great fights, some great wins. Won championship, wasn't crazily successful. Yeah, it wasn't perhaps the best of runs, but he featured in one championship, and now in BKFC as well. And if he wins this one, it's a huge win for his career. And so he has achieved a lot and has been an excellent fighter in mixed martial arts, and has really given his all to the sport, and has shown his versatility to be able to fight in so many different sanctioning bodies, because they or organizations, because they all are so different. And there are so many competing with the UFC. I mean, Stevens has fought with the PFL, it's another name competing with the UFC. Stevens, wasn't too successful there, but there's the names, obviously PFL and Bellator merged together. Seemingly the financial side of things looks like perhaps it's struggling to an extent a little bit with PFL and Bellator. So, I don't know how much of a threat they are, but I think One Championship have always gone under the radar a little bit, and are really are a great organization and should have bigger stars in which they have. They've recently, lost Demetrius Johnson, and that was quite a big knock for them, but they still have some excellent fights, some excellent Muay Thai fighters as well. And so, as a fan myself, I'm a big fan of the organization. And BKFC as well. I feel like they need more stars, and they really need to build up their fighters a bit better. And I don't know how the best way for them to do it is. Their biggest events have all been through, mainly Mike Perry and, ex UFC fighters fighting each other. And so it's just, I'm not too sure how they're going to go about creating that star. They've perhaps had that with Bryce Hall, who was meant to be on this card, not an ex UFC fighter. He was meant to fight Slice Jr., Kimbo Slice's son, who, ex fighter, that UFC name again. But for the most part, that would have been perhaps something a bit different if Hall was able to win. He says that he doesn't want to have too many fights in BKFC, but at least it's something a bit different. At least a young fighter, somebody who isn't just an ex-UFC fighter, like I say, something a bit different, and that's what maybe the fans are wanting a little bit more. I feel like they definitely need to be able to bring in more stars to be able to really kind of compete against the likes of a UFC and really kind of get their numbers to that level. But I'm sure this fight is going to sell well. It was a shame to see that Hall versus Slice Jr. For the card was a cancelled fight. Slice Jr. says, from what I read, he's trying to be a policeman, and he said that he couldn't commit enough time to fight Hall. I don't even know, but for the most part, I hope that fights get rescheduled, because I think that is a good matchup, and I think it's going to be an interesting fight. So I hope it does end up happening. I'm sure Hall will still be wanting to fight in BKFC. Like I say, Rothwell is another name to have, and when you look at this fight as a whole, perhaps you would say both of their best wins are against the same guy, being for Alvarez and Stevens, being Dos Anjos. Stevens beat Dos Anjos ages ago in 2008, and Dos Anjos lost versus Alvarez in UFC for the belt, and so they both, I suppose, have that similarity. That's one thing in which they have in common, which, to be fair, there isn't really too many things that they actually do have in common. But for the most part, I think that adds to the thing as well. And the fact that also Stevens has had that boxing experience. He boxed Jose Aldo and he drew, and that was on the Gamebred uh, show. And so he's shown that he's got that versatility in him as well, and he's not just a mixed martial artist. Perhaps he didn't have the best of mixed martial arts careers, but he definitely has that diversity in him, and so perhaps that variety in his game might be able to cause him to have success in this fight. But to speak about them both a bit more individually as fighters, Alvarez as a fighter, I believe he's a fast starter. I think you kind of have to be in BKFC. The way you stand, you are just in line with each other, face to face, not like boxing where you have to go from one side to the other, or UFC where you have to go one side to the other. You're in line straight face to face. You could pretty much just throw a punch from the get go and it will land. And so, you kind of have to be a fast starter. But Alvarez definitely did try and start fast versus Perry. He's got fast hands. To be fair, he's definitely able to still throw with at speed. I think Stevens hasn't got the slowest of hands either. I think they both have a bit of explosivity to them. I think it's definitely going to be, like I mentioned, interesting to see if Stevens comes up in weight, if he's going to slow down a little bit, or if Alvarez goes down in weight, if he's going to speed up a little bit. He leads off his jab well, and I think he utilises his jab well, and I think perhaps a lot of there is that BKFC clear style. Mike Perry had that clear style. It's a brawler type style. Majority of the kind of top level BKFC fighters have that style, which definitely isn't seen as that much of a technical boxing style. And, perhaps it's not easy on the eye if you love the kind of like really high skilled boxing side of things. But it's definitely entertaining. But I think Alvarez, shows a bit more with leading off the jab, and he's quite composed. You can tell that he's been in multiple high-level fights when he is fighting, even against Perry when he was getting caught with shots and when he was getting hurt. He still looked like he was, not out of his depth. He still looked comfortable. He still looked like he knew what was going on and was, still trying to fire back at times. He'll throw multiple shots. I feel like that's something in which he definitely has perhaps over that of Stevens. Stevens seemingly is going to lead off with the more singular shots than that of Alvarez. When he finds his range, sometimes it can take a little time for him to find his range, but when he does, for the most part, he's going to be able to land well. And like I said, leading off his jab, he can kind of burst up with that jab from quite low down, and he can have success with that. And he wants to typically fight at a bit of a mid-range. I think Stevens might be willing to accept that. I don't think it's going to be perhaps the high-intensity brawl in your face type fight in which most BKFC fans are used to. It might be maybe a bit more of a mid-range type fight. I'm not too sure. He often follows up on his shots very nicely. He's not got bad movement. Again, another thing, another stereotype of that of the BKFC style is that their movement is quite sluggish, quite flat-footed, quite slow, but I don't feel like either of these guys really go into that category too much, and also, again, minimal head movement. But again, like I said, I don't feel like these two guys really go into that too much, and he's got a good chin as well. Like I mentioned, I feel like you have to have a good chin when you're in BKFC because of what you're doing. Because you're getting punched with just a bare fist, you have to be able to have a good chin. As soon as that chin goes, then there's no point that you even fighting in BKFC, to be completely honest. Negatives about him, like I say, I feel like it does take time for him to find his range, and perhaps that was just against Perry because it was difficult, and I think he perhaps was reluctant a little bit, and I think he took some power shots from him, and I think he was a little bit nervous. Alvarez, I believe, fought Chad Mendes and then won that fight in BKFC, so he'd had a little bit of BKFC experience before, but I don't think he'd faced somebody as powerful, as strong as that of Mike Perry, and so I feel like perhaps maybe he was a little bit nervous to an extent. Maybe he was covering up a bit at times because he didn't really want to take too much damage. And I think he was, he had a good chin, and like I say, he didn't go down, but I think he was getting hurt with certain shots. He can get in my opinion, does have the lesser power out of the two. And to be honest, that is a very, very big factor. In times in boxing, you could say, having the lesser power isn't always that big of an issue. But in BKFC, I think the power is such an important part, and the way that you commit to your shots is so important. And I don't know if Alvarez commits to the shots enough to really generate enough power to be able to really cause a lot of damage. He can sometimes just be hopefully swinging with his shots and just hoping he's landing. But like I say, I don't really see too much power behind them shots when he is doing that. I think his timing can be off for the most part. I don't think Stevens' timing is anything too impressive either. But for the most part, I think his timing can be off. I think his physicality, he's not that physical. I don't think Stevens is incredibly physical, but perhaps he might be that bit stronger than that of Alvarez. He accepts the back foot and is probably willing to go on the back foot, which is definitely going to go into Stevens' favour. I think if you really put it on Stevens, he would go onto the back foot and would try and fight there, and I think that's where he would fight his worst game. But when Stevens is walking you down, picking his shots, that's going to be where he's at his best. He can wait in range. I think he can be beaten to the punch, and I think he was quite often beaten to the punch versus Perry. I think the impact of his shots, like I say, really isn't that impactful. And when you see the big, heavy punches in BKFC, you can see just the pure impact in which they have, in which I just don't think I've seen from Stevens. I think he headhunts. I think both of these fighters headhunt quite a lot. I think Perry went to the body quite well, and that showed uh, a higher bit of skill. I feel like a lot of fighters, again, another BKFC stereotype is that they don't really go to the body too much, and I don't think either of these fighters do. I think he can be a bit predictable at times, like I say, kind of coming with a jab and then leading off that. It can be a little bit predictable. I think he can admire his work. I think he can throw from afar. He's definitely got the wide hooks from which, like I say, stereotypically you do want to have as a brawler in BKFC, but sometimes they are very wide and thrown from very far out. And like I say, he can cover it up a bit if he does, get hurt. I feel like it's definitely something in which he's still getting used to, the whole BKFC sport. And I don't know, some fighters I'm sure would never get used to getting punched just by bare knuckle. To speak about Stevens as a fighter, though, he's definitely willing to fight on the back foot. Like I mentioned, I just don't think that's where he does his best work. I think, like I say, he's willing to do it, but I think he's best when he's walking you down and putting on the pressure. He's got mean uppercuts, and he definitely throws them with mean intentions, and has been able to score some quite impressive uppercuts when he is throwing them. And perhaps in my opinion, has more varied striking than that of Alvarez. He's going to fight at a high pace and definitely going to set a high pace. So if this is to go all 5 rounds, it's definitely going to be grueling and taxing on both fighters. And I'm sure if it does go all 5 rounds, it's going to be an absolute slugfest, no matter what skills they both have, no matter what differences they have between the two of them into the last couple rounds. He's got fast hands, I believe himself. He's always kind of twitching, which is, what you see from a lot of BKFC fighters, just them subtle kind of twitching feints where they never kind of stood still too long. It shows that they can kind of explode into their shots a bit better, I suppose. I think he's patient with his work, and I think he picks his shots well when he's fighting at a mid-range. He's able to pick his shots well, so if he allows Alvarez to fight at the mid-range, he might be able to find his range a bit better than that of Alvarez, and also land with more effect whilst doing so. He's got a good chin, like I say, I feel like you have to. He's tough and rugged. You can see that he can take a shot and keep coming forward and really bite down on that gum shield. He's not got bad head movements, like I say. Neither of them have got the worst of movement, and that is quite refreshing to see, to be completely honest. And like I mentioned, when he is walking you down, he's going to probably have the most amount of success being patient behind his work. And like I said, I feel like he has the more varied striking. Negatives about him, I think he can sometimes struggle to handle in close. I think when he's in close and when he's controlling the pace, he's comfortable and he's able to land, like I mentioned, them mean uppercuts. But when you're offering that kind of onrushing pressure, that in your face explosive type pressure, I still think he isn't able to handle it too well. And like I said, the timing, he wasn't able to always handle it. And like I say, fighting on the back foot, he's not always the best with that. And I think Alvarez might be able to tie up that bit better than that of Stevens. Like I mentioned, I feel like he can sometimes lead with singular shots. So if this is a point scoring thing, which I mean most of the time BKFC isn't, but if this is a point scoring thing, then the singular shots might not be the best thing to favour Stevens. He squares up, both fighters will square up. That is, something that is inevitable with BKFC. He headhunts as well. I think he does, you know, rush in a little bit at some points as well, and perhaps leave himself a little bit open whilst doing so. I think, like I said, I don't think he's incredibly physical, just maybe a little bit more than that of Alvarez. I think if he misses his shots, then he can really become a bit messy and a bit brawly, and just not really have an answer if he misses that singular shot that he's waiting to try and land. And so Alvarez might bait him into that type of shot. He's definitely got the experience at a high level to try and do that. And when the fight is not at his tempo, then that's where he's not going to be having the best of success. That's where, like I say, things might become that bit more difficult for him, and he might not be able to handle the onrushing pressure, like I say, if he's not fighting at his pace. Alvarez is the favourite for this fight, and I think that Stevens is going to win via unanimous decision. I think it is going to be probably into the later rounds, like most BKFC fights, an absolute slugfest. But I think Stevens is going to be able to land them better, more significant, more stronger strikes at a mid-range, and I think Alvarez is going to be comfortable fighting at a mid-range, but I don't think he's going to be able to cause as much damage as that of Stevens, and so I think it's going to be perhaps a surprising victory to an extent for fans of the UFC, like I say, from 10 years ago, from 5 years ago even really, but I still think that Stevens is going to win, like I mentioned, via unanimous decision. And that's huge for his career. That's definitely would be the highlight of his whole career, to be completely honest. Some fighters have to wait into their 30 to their late 30s to even have that kind of prime, and perhaps this could be it for Stevens. And then realistically, he becomes the main focus. He becomes the main attraction of BKFC, and so that is a huge accolade to have on his shoulders. And then who he could go on to fight next? The options are really endless, to be honest. I mean, I would love to see him probably continue to fight these UFC fighters. Perhaps it would be unfair for him to do that because, like I mentioned, the BKFC need more stars, and perhaps the best way for them to have a star is for them to, put the UFC fighters against fighters in which are BKFC champions. But I just don't see it happening. I feel like the money is where it's at with the UFC fighters coming up. So, it probably would make sense if he fights another one. Somebody like Perry, if Perry does come back, that might happen. McGregor, you never really know what's happening with him. And as it is his organisation, perhaps it might be an easy fight to make. And, I don't think anybody has any idea what's going on with his UFC contract or not. But to be honest, at this rate, I feel like Dana White might even just be willing for him to go off and do his own thing. I feel like he might be a bit of a burden on the UFC currently. Masvidal could be a fight. Masvidal seemingly getting himself back in the USADA testing pool for the UFC, so perhaps he wants to go down that route and try and make some sort of venture back into the UFC, which is interesting because he had the whole thing with Gamebred, and it seemed like he was wanting to perhaps box, but now it seems like he might want to go back into the UFC again. Yoel Romero, that could happen. It seems like Yoel Romero might be going into the GFL, which is like I think a new thing coming up with a lot of ex UFC fighters again coming onto that. Shogun Rua, I think, is one of the fighters to be listed with that as well. So I don't really know what's happening with that, but he is of course coming off that big win on Dirty Boxing. Diaz, that could happen. There's not really too much talks of what's going on with Nate Diaz, and I would still personally love to see Nate Diaz in BKFC. I think there's definitely a market there for him. I think he's shown that he can still take a punch, and I think it would just be so entertaining. And perhaps one more thing he can take off in his career, even if he does lose. Or perhaps Jose Aldo again. That could be an option. He obviously drew versus Stevens in boxing and then went into the UFC, fought Batista, and then I believe he won. And then his next fight after that, he went on to lose. So, I don't necessarily know if he believes that he's got too much left in the UFC. Perhaps he might be wanting that new test. Perhaps he might be able to see Stevens as a bit of a weaker option, but he has drew. And so perhaps there is that narrative there for them to be making that second fight. And so we'll have to wait and see if that happens. But yeah, that is it for today's video. Hope you did enjoy. Like the video if you did indeed like the video, subscribe if you're new, and thanks for watching.